My name is Lauren. I'm 30 years old, and for a long time I thought I was living inside a relationship that was steady, honest, and quietly secure. I met Ryan through mutual friends at a small house gathering. Nothing dramatic. He wasn't loud or overly charming. He was attentive in a way that felt grounding. He listened more than he spoke, remembered things I said weeks later. At that point in my life, that felt like safety. When we moved in together, it felt like the natural next step, not a leap. We split expenses evenly. We built routines. Sunday groceries, weekday dinners, late night conversations that faded into comfortable silence. Ryan worked in consulting, or at least that was how he explained it. His schedule was flexible. Some weeks busy, some weeks quiet. I never questioned it because I trusted him. That trust didn't break all at once. It thinned. Small things shifted. His phone stopped leaving his hand. Notifications were silenced more often. He stepped outside to take calls he used to answer openly. When I asked about his day, the answers stayed surface level. Not evasive, just incomplete. One night I teased him about it. "You're getting mysterious," I said. He smiled, kissed my forehead, and said work was complicated lately. I accepted that explanation because nothing else about him felt wrong. But living together changes what you notice. Certain evenings he dressed differently. Sharper, more intentional. Not like someone running errands or meeting coworkers. Like someone preparing to be seen. He'd say he had meetings or dinners or obligations that wouldn't interest me. I never insisted on coming along. Then one afternoon, while folding laundry, I found a jacket I didn't recognize. Expensive fabric. Perfectly pressed. It smelled like a cologne I'd never bought him. When I asked about it, he laughed lightly. Said he'd had it forever. Said I probably just forgot. I let it go. What unsettled me wasn't that jacket. It was the growing sense that his stories didn't quite overlap anymore. Details didn't repeat. Timelines didn't reinforce each other. He wasn't lying outright. He was curating. The first moment that truly stayed with me happened late one evening. Ryan stepped onto the balcony to take a call and didn't fully close the door. I wasn't trying to listen. I just froze when I heard my name. "She doesn't know," he said quietly, "and she doesn't need to." There was no panic in his voice, no guilt, just certainty. I didn't confront him. I didn't ask who he was talking to or what he meant. I watched instead. I noticed patterns. Certain nights were off limits. Certain explanations recycled themselves. His tone shifted depending on who he spoke to. With me, it was gentle. With others, it carried a confidence I rarely heard at home. A few weeks later, while mindlessly scrolling, I saw his face where I wasn't expecting it. Not tagged, not shared with me. Just there. A photo from an event he'd said was work-related. He stood beside a woman I didn't know, his hand resting comfortably at her back. They looked familiar with each other, not new, not cautious. The caption wasn't dramatic, just confident. Proud. I didn't feel shock. I felt alignment. Like the missing pieces finally decided to show themselves. I closed the app and sat quietly, realizing something important. Ryan wasn't hiding a mistake. He was maintaining another life. And he had no idea I had already started seeing all of it. Once I accepted that Ryan wasn't who I thought he was, everything around me sharpened. I stopped reacting emotionally. I stopped searching for reassurance. I started paying attention. Ryan didn't notice the change. He still came home, still asked how my day was, still kissed me goodnight. The difference was that I was no longer filling in the gaps for him. I let the silence sit. And in that silence, things surfaced. He began spending more time away from the apartment. Always with explanations that sounded reasonable on their own, but didn't line up when placed side by side. Meetings that ran late but never overlapped. Dinners that were always scheduled on the same nights. Weekends, he said, were unpredictable but somehow followed a pattern. I didn't follow him. I didn't check his phone. I didn't need to. The second life revealed itself in fragments. A comment he made casually about a restaurant I'd never heard of, spoken like it was familiar. A name he almost mentioned and then corrected himself. The way he avoided certain parts of town entirely when we were together, but mentioned them freely in passing. One evening he came home later than usual. Not rushed, not apologetic. Calm. He mentioned he'd been discussing a long-term plan with people who mattered. I asked, "Who?" He smiled. "You know, work." That was when I noticed something else. Ryan had stopped including me in his future language. He talked about goals, moves, possibilities, but never said we. It was subtle, almost unintentional. Almost. A few days later, I found a receipt in the glove compartment while grabbing a pen. It wasn't recent, but it wasn't old either. A place I knew. One he told me he didn't like. I didn't confront him. Instead, I started preparing. Quietly. I separated what needed to be separate. I saved copies of shared documents. I updated access points he didn't need anymore. I didn't do it out of anger. I did it because clarity had replaced hope. What surprised me most was how peaceful I felt. When you stop guessing, you stop hurting. Ryan continued living as if nothing had changed. He talked about trips, about plans, about responsibilities that existed somewhere outside our life together. One night, he mentioned someone who really understood him. I smiled and nodded. By then, I had seen more than enough to know this wasn't an affair born of impulse. It was deliberate, structured, maintained. He wasn't confused, he was organized. And the irony was, the more confident he became, the less careful he was, because he believed I was still the woman who trusted him without question. He believed I was still inside the version of the relationship he controlled. He didn't realize I had already stepped out of it. The overlap started quietly, almost politely, as if the truth didn't want to startle anyone. Ryan became careless in small ways. Not obvious mistakes, just assumptions. He assumed I wasn't listening. He assumed I wasn't connecting dots. He assumed comfort meant blindness. One afternoon, he mentioned a weekend plan that didn't exist on our shared calendar. He spoke about it casually, like it had already been discussed. I didn't correct him. I asked a simple question instead. "Oh, where is that?" He hesitated, just a fraction of a second, long enough to register. "Out of town," he said. "Work thing." I nodded and went back to what I was doing. Later that same week, while scrolling through my phone at work, I saw a familiar background flash past my screen. It was subtle. A story posted by someone I didn't follow directly, but whose content had started appearing more often. The same restaurant, the same lighting, the same table he once described to me in detail, as if it were part of his routine. This time, he wasn't alone. The woman from the photo was there again, sitting across from him, laughing, comfortable, tagged location, tagged friends, tagged life. It struck me then how much effort it must have taken to keep the two worlds separate. Different language, different habits, different promises, and how exhausting it must have been to believe he could maintain it forever. That night, Ryan came home unusually upbeat. He talked about progress, about momentum, about how things were finally aligning. I listened. He asked me if everything was okay, if I seemed distant. I smiled and said, "I'm just thinking." He looked relieved. The next shift came when his family entered the picture. Ryan had always kept his family at a polite distance from our relationship. Occasional calls, brief visits, nothing intrusive. That changed suddenly. He mentioned his mother more, referenced advice she'd given, compared perspectives that hadn't been part of our conversations before. One evening he said something that stopped me cold. "My mom thinks it's important to surround yourself with people who really fit your future." He said it lightly, casually. I asked, "And what does that mean?" He shrugged, "Just alignment." I didn't argue, but I understood. That was when I realized the second life wasn't just romantic. It was social, familial, integrated. I was no longer the center of his story. I was the background. Over the next few days, I noticed him pulling away emotionally while remaining physically present. He still slept beside me, still shared meals, but his attention drifted elsewhere, as if he were already transitioning. What he didn't realize was that I had already finished grieving the relationship he thought he was leaving. Grief doesn't always look like sadness. Sometimes it looks like preparation. I began to imagine my life without him. Not dramatically, not painfully, practically. What it would feel like to wake up without second guessing, to speak without filtering, to trust my instincts again. Ryan mistook my calm for acceptance. He mistook my silence for compliance. And that was his biggest miscalculation. Because when the collision finally came, it didn't come from confrontation, it came from exposure. The collision didn't happen the way movies portray it. There was no dramatic reveal, no shouting, no moment where everyone froze in place. It happened through assumption. Ryan assumed I wouldn't be somewhere I had every right to be. A coworker invited me to a small networking gathering one evening. Casual, quiet. the kind of thing I usually skipped. This time I didn't. I arrived late, stood near the back, and listened more than I spoke. And then I saw him. Ryan was across the room, relaxed in a way he never was at home anymore. He wasn't scanning the space or checking his phone. He was present, engaged, familiar. The woman stood beside him. She laughed at something he said and touched his arm without hesitation. He didn't pull away. For a brief moment our eyes met. His face changed, not shock, not fear, calculation. He recovered quickly, excused himself from the group, and walked toward me with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "What are you doing here?" he asked, voice controlled. "I was invited," I said, calm, honest. He glanced behind him, then back at me. "This isn't really your scene." That sentence told me everything I needed to know. He introduced me to the woman moments later. Her name was Natalie. She shook my hand warmly, genuinely. She didn't know, not yet. "This is Lauren," he said. "A friend?" I smiled. I didn't correct him. The rest of the evening passed politely, almost pleasantly. Natalie talked about plans Ryan had never mentioned to me. Trips, long-term goals, people he described to me as clients but spoke of to her as partners. Ryan watched me carefully the entire time, waiting for me to say something. I never did. When we got home, he finally broke. "Why didn't you tell me you were coming?" he asked. "I didn't think I needed permission," I replied. Silence stretched between us. He tried to explain. Not apologize. Explain. He said things were complicated, that he hadn't planned for things to overlap, that he hadn't known how to end one chapter without damaging another. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, I said quietly, "How long were you planning to let me live in the dark?" He didn't answer. That was the answer. I didn't ask him to leave that night. I didn't cry. I didn't demand anything. I told him I needed space. He packed a bag. The next few weeks were strange. Calm, detached. Ryan tried to maintain contact, checking in with concern that felt more like guilt. Natalie reached out once, confused but polite, asking for clarity. I told her the truth, not with anger, not with accusation, just facts. She thanked me. Ryan never expected that outcome. He expected confrontation, drama, a fight he could navigate. What he got instead was removal. By the time he realized both versions of his life were gone, I was already settled into mine.